Hello everyone, I am back with some more lunchtime story times. I've got my Baby Yoda t-shirt and my beautiful birthday crown that my friend Kate gave me. And I figured, why not wear a crown? It's Monday, so that's what I'm doing today. Today I'm going to be reading a book that I love called Bedtime for Francis by Russell Hoban. As you can see, the copy that I recently bought got left out in the rain, so it's a little messed up, but that's okay. It just means that it's been well loved. So we will read Bedtime for Francis. This is Francis, by the way. I think she's a badger. My dachshund would not be happy with that because my dachshund hates badgers, but she'll be okay with Francis. The big hand of the clock is at 12. The little hand is at 7. It is 7 o'clock. It is bedtime for Francis. Mother said, "It's time for bed." Father said, "It's time for bed." Francis said, "I want a glass of milk." "All right," said Father. "All right," said Mother. "You may have a glass of milk." Francis drank the milk. "Carry me to my room, Father," said Francis. "All right," said Father. "Piggyback," said Francis. So Father carried her piggyback to her room. Father kissed Francis goodnight. Mother kissed Francis goodnight. Francis said, "May I sleep with my teddy bear?" Father gave her the teddy bear. Francis said, "May I sleep with my doll too?" Mother gave her her doll. "Good night, Francis," said Father. "Good night, Francis," said Mother. "Did you kiss me?" said Francis. "Yes," said Mother. "Yes," said Father. And here you can see her having a piggyback. "Kiss me again," said Francis. Father kissed her again. Mother kissed her again. They closed the door. "May I have my door open?" said Francis. Father opened the door. "Good night," said Mother. "Good night," said Father. "Good night," said Francis. Francis could not sleep. She closed her eyes, but she still could not sleep. So she began to sing a little song about the alphabet. She made it up as she went along. A is for apple pie, B is for bear, C is for crocodile combing his hair, D is for dumplings. Francis kept singing through E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, and R, and she had no trouble until she got near the end of the alphabet. S is for sailboat, T is for tiger, U is for underwear down in the dryer. Francis stopped because dryer did not sound like tiger. She started to think about tigers. She thought about big tigers and little tigers, baby tigers and mother tigers and father tigers, sister tigers and brother tigers, aunt tigers and uncle tigers. "I wonder if there are any tigers around here," she said. Francis looked around her room. She thought maybe she could see a tiger in the corner. She was not afraid, but she wanted to be sure. And here is Francis singing her little song in bed. So she looked again. She was sure she could see a tiger. She went to tell Mother and Father. "There is a tiger in my room," said Francis. "Did he bite you?" said Father. "No," said Francis. "Did he scratch you?" said Mother. "No," said Francis. "Then he is a friendly tiger," said Father. "He will not hurt you. Go back to sleep." "Do I have to?" said Francis. "Yes," said Father. "Yes," said Mother. Father kissed her. Mother kissed her. Francis went back to bed and finished her song on the way. She still could not sleep. Francis opened her eyes and looked around. She saw something big and dark. "Giants are big and dark," she thought. "Maybe that is a giant. I think it is a giant." I think that giant wants to get me. She went into the living room again, and see, here is a giant. Maybe. Mother and Father were watching television and having tea and cake. Frances said, "There is a giant in my room. May I watch television?" "No," said Mother. "No," said Father. Frances said, "The giant wants to get me. May I have some cake?" Father gave Frances a piece of cake. Father said, "How do you know he wants to get you?" Frances said, "Isn't that what giants do?" Father said, "Not always. Why don't you ask him what he wants?" Frances went back to her room. She went right over to the giant. She said, "What do you want, giant?" She took a good look at him. There was no giant. It was just a chair and her bathrobe. So she went to bed again. Frances was not very tired and did not close her eyes. She looked up at the ceiling. There was a crack in the ceiling, and she thought about it. Let's see, here is a crack in the ceiling. Maybe something will come out of that crack, she thought. Maybe bugs or spiders. Maybe something with a lot of skinny legs in the dark. She went to get Father. He was brushing his teeth. Frances said, "Something scary is going to come out of the crack in the ceiling. I forgot to brush my teeth." Father said, "You brush your teeth, and I will have a look." Frances brushed her teeth. Father came back and said, "Nothing could come out of such a little crack, but if you are worried about it, get someone to help you watch. You can take turns." Frances told her teddy bear to watch. They took turns for a while. Then Frances got tired of it and let Teddy Bear do all the watching. Frances got up and went to the bathroom. When she came back, she was not sleepy at all. The window was open and the wind was blowing the curtains. See, there's the wind blowing the curtains. "I do not like the way those curtains are moving," said Frances. "Maybe there is something waiting very soft and quiet. Maybe it moves the curtains just to see if I am watching." She went into Mother and Father's room to tell them. They were asleep. Frances stood by Father's side of the bed very quietly, right near his head. See? She was so quiet that she was the quietest thing in the room. She was so quiet that Father woke up all of a sudden, with his eyes wide open. He said, "Umph!" Frances said, "There is something moving the curtains. May I sleep with you?" Father said, "Listen, Frances, do you want to know why the curtains are moving?" "Why?" said Frances. "That is the wind's job," said Father. "Every night the wind has to go around and blow all the curtains." "How can the wind have a job?" said Frances. "Everybody has a job," said Father. "I have to go to my office every morning at 9 o'clock. That is my job. You have to go to sleep so you can be wide awake for school tomorrow. That is your job." Frances said, "I know, but—" Father said, "I have not finished. If the wind does not blow the curtains, he will be out of a job. If I do not go to the office, I will be out of a job. And if you do not go to sleep now, do you know what will happen to you?" "I will be out of a job?" said Frances. "No," said Father. "I will get a spanking?" said Frances. "Right," said Father. "Good night," said Frances, and she went back to her room. Frances closed the window and got into bed. Suddenly there was a noise at the window. She heard bump and thump. "I know something will get me this time," she thought. She jumped out of bed and went to tell Mother and Father. When she got to their door, she thought about it some more and decided not to tell them. She went back to her room. Frances heard the noise at the window again. She pulled the covers up over her head. "I wonder what it is," she thought. "If it is something very bad, Father will have to come and chase it away." She pulled off the covers and stood on her bed so she could look out the window. She saw a moth bumping against the window. Bump and thump, his wings smacked the glass. Whack and smack made Frances think of spanking, and all of a sudden she was tired. She lay down and closed her eyes so she could think better. She thought, there were so many giants and tigers and scary and exciting things before that I am pretty tired now. That is just a moth, and he is only doing his job, the same as the wind. His job is bumping and thumping, and my job is to sleep. So she went to sleep and did not get out of bed again until Mother called her for breakfast. And that is the end of Bedtime for Frances. I love these books because they remind me of when I was a young girl, because I also didn't want to go to bed, and my dad would also be annoyed with me, but very gently and generously. So that is Bedtime for Frances. And because we have a little bit more time, we can also read some Paddington Bear. So, I do believe that we are on part 2. Paddington Lends a Paw. And we're going to read chapter 6 today, A Spot of Decorating. Paddington gave a deep sigh and pulled his hat down over his ears in an effort to keep out the noise. There was such a hullabaloo going on, it was difficult to write up the notes in his scrapbook. The excitement had all started when Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird received an unexpected invitation to a wedding. Luckily, both Jonathan and Judy were out for the day, or things might have been far worse. Paddington hadn't been included in the invitation, but he didn't really mind. He didn't like weddings very much, apart from the free cake, and he had been promised a piece of cake whether he went or not. All the same, he was beginning to wish everyone would hurry up and go. He had a special reason for wanting to be alone that day. He sighed again, wiped the pen carefully on the back of his paw, and then mopped up some ink blots, which somehow or other had found their way onto the table. He was only just in time, for at that moment the door burst open, and Mrs. Brown rushed in. "Ah, there you are, Paddington!" She stopped short in the middle of the room and stared at him. "Why on earth are you wearing your hat indoors?" she asked. "And why is your tongue all blue?" Paddington stuck out his tongue as far as he could. "It is a funny color," he admitted, squinting down it with interest. "Perhaps I'm sick with something." "You'll be sick all right if you don't clear up this mess," grumbled Mrs. Bird as she entered. "Just look at it. Bottles of ink, glue, bits of paper, my best sewing scissors, marmalade all over the table runner, and goodness knows what else." Paddington looked around. It was a bit of a mess. "I've almost finished," he announced. "I've just got to make a few more lines and things. I've been writing my memoirs." Paddington took his scrapbook very seriously and spent many long hours carefully pasting in pictures and writing up his adventures. Since he'd been at the Browns, so much had happened that it was now more than half full. "Well, make sure you do clear everything up," said Mrs. Brown, "or we won't bring you back any cake. Now, do take care of yourself, and don't forget, when the baker comes, we want 2 loaves. With that, she waved goodbye and followed Mrs. Bird out of the room. "You know," said Mrs. Bird as she stepped into the car, "I have a feeling that bear has something up his paw. He seemed most anxious for us to leave." "Oh, I don't know," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't see what he can do. We won't be away all that long." "Ah," said Mrs. Bird darkly, "that may be, but he's been hanging about on the landing upstairs half the morning. I'm sure he's up to something." Mr. Brown, who didn't like weddings much either and was secretly wishing he could stay home with Paddington, looked over his shoulder as he let in the clutch. "Perhaps I ought to stay as well," he said. "Then I could get on with decorating his new room." "Now, Henry," said Mrs. Brown firmly, "you're coming to the wedding, and that's that. Paddington will be quite all right by himself. He's a very capable bear. And as for your wanting to get on with decorating his new room, you haven't done a thing about it for over a fortnight, so I'm sure it can wait one more day." Paddington's new room had become a sore spot in the Brown household. It was over 2 weeks since Mr. Brown had first thought of doing it. So far, he had stripped all the old wallpaper from the walls, removed the picture rails, the wood round the doors, the door handle, and everything else that was loose, or that he had made loose, and bought a lot of bright new wallpaper and some paint. And that's where he had stopped. In the back of the car, Mrs. Bird pretended she hadn't heard a thing. An idea had suddenly come into her mind, and she was hoping it hadn't entered Paddington's as well. But Mrs. Bird knew the workings of Paddington's mind better than most, and she feared the worst. Had she but known, her fears were being realized at that very moment. Paddington was busy scratching out the words, "at a loose end," in his scrapbook, and was adding, in large capital letters, the ominous words, "decorating my new room." It was while he'd been writing "at a loose end" in his scrapbook earlier in the day that the idea had come to him. Paddington had noticed in the past that he often got his best ideas when he was at a loose end. For a long while, all his belongings had been packed away ready for the big move to his new room, and he was beginning to get impatient. Every time he wanted anything special, he had to undo yards of string and brown paper. Having underlined the words in red, Paddington cleared everything up, locked his scrapbook carefully in his suitcase, and hurried upstairs. He had several times offered to lend a paw with the decorating, but for some reason or other, Mr. Brown had put his foot down on the idea and hadn't even allowed him in the room while work was in progress. Paddington couldn't quite understand why. He was sure he would be very good at it. The room in question was an old spare room that had not been used for a number of years, and when he entered it, Paddington found it was even more interesting than he had expected. He closed the door carefully behind him and sniffed. There was an exciting smell of paint and whitewash in the air. Not only that, but there were some ladders, a work table, several brushes, a number of rolls of wallpaper, and a big pail of whitewash. The room had a lovely echo as well, and he spent a long time sitting in the middle of the floor while he was stirring the paint, just listening to his new voice. There were so many different and interesting things around that it was a job to know what to do first. Eventually, Paddington decided on the painting. Choosing one of Mr. Brown's best brushes, he dipped it into the can of paint and then looked round for the room for something to dab it on. It wasn't until he had been working on the window frame for several minutes that he began to wish he had started on something else. The brush made his arm ache, and when he tried dipping his paw in the paint can instead and rubbing it on, more paint seemed to go onto the glass than onto the wooden frame, so that the room became quite dark. And here is Paddington painting the window. "Perhaps," said Paddington, waving the brush in the air and addressing the room in general, "perhaps, if I do the ceiling first with the whitewash, I can cover all the drips on the wall with the wallpaper." But when Paddington started work on the whitewashing, he found it was almost as hard as painting. Even by standing on tiptoe at the very top of the ladder, he had a job to reach the ceiling. The bucket of whitewash was much too heavy for him to lift, so he had to come down the steps every time in order to dip the brush in. And when he carried the brush up again, the whitewash ran down his paw and made his fur all matted. Looking around him, Paddington began to wish he was still at a loose end. Things were beginning to get in rather a mess again. He felt sure Mrs. Bird would have something to say when she saw it. Here's Paddington with the whitewash. It was then that he had a brainwave. Paddington was a resourceful bear, and he didn't like being beaten by things. Recently, he had become interested in a house that was being built nearby. He had first seen it from the window of his bedroom, and since then he'd seen many hours talking to the men and watching while they hoisted their tools and cement up to the top floor by means of a rope and pulley. Once, Mr. Briggs, the foreman, had even taken him up in the bucket too, and had let him lay several bricks. Now the Browns' house was an old one, and in the middle of the ceiling there was a large hook where a big lamp had once hung. Not only in that, but in one corner of the room there was a thin coil of rope as well. Paddington set to work quickly. First, he tied one end of the rope to the handle of the bucket. Then he climbed up the ladder and passed the other end through the hook in the ceiling. But even so, when he had climbed down again, it still took him a long time to pull the bucket anywhere near the top of the steps. It was full to the brim and very heavy, so he had to stop every few seconds and tie the other end of the rope to the ladder for safety. It was when he undid the rope for the last time that things started to go really wrong. As Paddington closed his eyes and leaned back for the final pull, he suddenly felt, to his surprise, as if he were floating on air. It was a most strange feeling. He reached out one foot and waved it around. There was definitely nothing there. He opened one eye and then nearly let go of the rope in astonishment as he saw the bucket of whitewash going past him on its way down. Suddenly, everything seemed to happen at once. Before he could even reach out a paw or shout for help, his head hit the ceiling and there was a clang as the bucket hit the floor. For a few seconds, Paddington clung there, kicking the air and not knowing what to do. Then there was a gurgling sound from below. Looking down, he saw to his horror that all the whitewash was running out of the bucket. He felt the rope begin to move again as the bucket got lighter, and then it shot past him again as he descended to land with a bump in the middle of the sea of whitewash. Even then, his troubles weren't over. As he tried to regain his balance on the slippery floor, he let go of the rope, and with a rushing noise, the bucket shot downwards again and landed on top of his head, completely covering him. Paddington lay on his back for several minutes, trying to get his breath back and wondering what had hit him. When he did sit up and take the bucket off his head, he quickly put it back on again. There was whitewash all over the floor. The paint cans had been upset, making little rivers of brown and green, and Mr. Brown's work hat was floating in one corner of the room. When Paddington saw it, he felt very glad he'd left his hat downstairs. One thing was certain. He was going to have a lot of explaining to do. And that was going to be even more difficult than usual because he couldn't even explain to himself what quite had gone wrong. It was some while later, when he was sitting on the upturned bucket thinking about things, that the idea of doing the wallpapering came to him. Paddington had a hopeful nature, and he believed in looking on the bright side. If he did the wallpaper really well, the others might not even notice the mess he had made. Paddington was fairly confident about the wallpapering. Unknown to Mr. Brown, he had often watched him in the past through a crack in the door, and it looked quite simple. All you had to do was brush some sticky stuff on the back of the paper and then put it on the wall. The high parts weren't too difficult, even for a bear, because you could fold the paper in two and put a broom in the middle where the fold was. Then you simply pushed the broom up and down the wall in case there were any nasty wrinkles. Paddington felt much more cheerful once he'd thought of the wallpapering. He found some paste already mixed in another bucket, which he put on top of the table while he unrolled the paper. It was a little difficult at first, because every time he tried to unroll the paper, he had to crawl along the table, pushing it with his paws, and the other end rolled up again and folded behind him. But eventually, he managed to get one piece completely covered in paste. He climbed down off the table, carefully avoiding the worst of the whitewash, which by now was beginning to dry in very large lumps, and lifted the sheet of wallpaper onto a broom. It was a long sheet of paper, much longer than it had seemed when he was putting the paste on, and somehow or other, as Paddington waved the broom about over his head, it began to wrap itself around him. After a struggle, he managed to push his way out and head in the general direction of a piece of wall. And here is Paddington, all wrapped up in the wallpaper. He stood back and surveyed the results. The paper was torn in several places, and there seemed to be a lot of paste on the outside, but Paddington felt quite pleased with himself. He decided to try another piece, then another, running backwards and forwards between the table and the walls as fast as his legs could carry him, in an effort to get it all finished before the Browns returned. Some of the pieces didn't quite join, and others overlapped, and on most of them there were some very odd patches of paste and whitewash. None of the pieces were as straight as he would have liked, but when he put his head on one side and squinted, Paddington felt the overall effect was quite nice. It was as he was taking a final look around the room at his handiwork that he noticed something very strange. There was a window, and there was also a fireplace. But there was no longer any sign of a door. Paddington stopped squinting, and his eyes grew rounder and rounder. He distinctly remembered that there had been a door, because he had come through it. He blinked at all four walls. It was difficult to see properly because the paint on the window glass had started to dry and hardly any light was coming through. But there most definitely was not a door. "I can't understand it," said Mr. Brown as he entered the dining room. "I've looked everywhere and there's no sign of Paddington. I told you I should have stayed at home with him." Mrs. Brown looked worried. "Oh dear, I hope nothing's happened to him. It's so unlike him to go out without leaving a note." "He's not in his room," said Judy. "Mr. Gruber hasn't seen him either," added Jonathan. "I've just been down to the market, and he says he hasn't seen him since they had cocoa together this morning." "Have you seen Paddington anywhere?" asked Mrs. Brown as Mrs. Bird entered carrying a tray of supper things. "I don't know about Paddington," said Mrs. Bird. "I've been having enough trouble with the water pipes without missing bears. I think they've got an airlock or something. They've been banging away ever since we came in." Mr. Brown listened for a moment. "It does sound like water pipes," he said. "And yet, it isn't regular enough somehow." He went outside into the hall. "It's a sort of thumping noise." "Gosh!" shouted Jonathan. "Listen! It's someone sending an SOS!" Everyone exchanged glances, and then in one voice cried, "Paddington!" "Mercy me," said Mrs. Bird as they burst through the papered-up door. "There must have been an earthquake or something, and either that's Paddington or it's his ghost." She pointed towards a small white figure as it rose from an upturned bucket to greet them. "I couldn't find the door," said Paddington plaintively. "I think I must have papered it over when I did the decorating. It was there when I came in. I remember seeing it, so I banged on the floor with a broom handle." "Gosh!" said Jonathan admiringly. "What a mess!" "You papered it over when you did the decorating," repeated Mr. Brown. He was a bit slow to grasp things sometimes. "That's right," said Paddington. "I did it as a surprise." He waved a paw round the room. "I'm afraid it's in a bit of a mess, but it isn't dry yet." While the idea was slowly sinking into Mr. Brown's mind, Mrs. Bird came to Paddington's rescue. "Now, it's not a bit of good holding an inquest," she said. "What's done is done, and if you ask me, it's a good thing, too. Now perhaps we shall get some proper decorators in to do the job." With that, she took hold of Paddington's paw and led him out of the room. "And as for you, young bear, you're going straight into a hot bath before all that plaster and stuff sets hard." Mr. Brown looked after the retreating figures of Mrs. Bird and Paddington, and then at the long trail of white footprints and paw marks. "Bears," he said bitterly. Paddington hung about in his room for a long time after his bath, and waited until the last possible minute before going downstairs to supper. He had a nasty feeling that he was in disgrace. But surprisingly, the word decorating wasn't mentioned at all that evening. Even more surprisingly, when he was sitting up in bed drinking his cocoa, several people came to see him, and each of them gave him 10 pence. It was all very mysterious, but Paddington didn't like to ask why, in case they changed their minds. It was Judy who solved the problem for him when she came in to say good night. "I suppose Mummy and Mrs. Bird gave you 10 pence because they don't want Daddy to do any more decorating," she explained. "He always starts things and never finishes them. And I suppose Daddy gave you some because he didn't want to finish it anyway. Now they're getting a proper decorator in, so everyone's happy." Paddington sipped his cocoa thoughtfully. "Perhaps if I did another room, I'd get another 30 pence, he said. "Oh, no, you don't," said Judy sternly. "You've done quite enough for one day, and if I were you, I shouldn't mention the word decorating for a long time to come." "Perhaps you're right," said Paddington sleepily, as he stretched out his paws. "But I was at a loose end." And that is the end of the chapter. So thank you all for joining me, and I will be back at the regular noontime hour tomorrow. Today I had to go to the vet, which is why this was a little bit late. But I hope you enjoyed the stories, and I hope that the weather is nice where you are and you get to enjoy some outdoor time. Bye!